All right, welcome to another episode of Mike Reads. Tonight we'll be continuing in our series on Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. We are on our sixth video in Chapter 11, which is Of the Rent of Land. We are in the middle of Part 3, and where we are in the middle of Part 3 is in a topic entitled Digression Concerning the Variations in the Value of Silver During the Course of the 4 Last Centuries. He breaks this up into 3 periods. We're about halfway through the first period, which we should be able to get through by the end of tonight. So on that note, let's dive right on in. The reader will find at the end of this chapter all the prices of wheat which have been collected by Fleetwood from 1202 to 1597, both inclusive, reduced to the money of the present times and digested according to the order of time into 7 divisions of 12 years each. At the end of each division, too, he will find the average price of the 12 years of which it consists. In that long period of time, Fleetwood has been able to collect the prices of no more than 80 years, so that 4 years are wanting to make out the last 12 years. I have added, therefore, from the accounts of Eton College, the prices of 1598, 1599, 1600, and 1601. It is the only addition which I have made. The reader will see that from the beginning of the 13th till after the middle of the 16th century, the average price of each 12 years grows gradually lower and lower, and that towards the end of the 16th century it begins to rise again. The prices, indeed, which Fleetwood has been able to collect seem to have been those chiefly which were remarkable for extraordinary dearness or cheapness, and I do not pretend that any very certain conclusion can be drawn from them. So far, however, as they prove anything at all, they confirm the account which I have been endeavoring to give. Fleetwood himself, however, seems with most other writers to have believed that during all this period the value of silver, in consequence of its increasing abundance, was continually diminishing. The prices of corn which he himself has collected certainly do not agree with this opinion. They agree perfectly with that of Mr. Dupré de Saint-Maur, and with that which I have been endeavoring to explain. Bishop Fleetwood and Mr. Dupré de Saint-Maur are the two authors who seem to have collected, with the greatest diligence and fidelity, the prices of things in ancient times. It is somewhat curious that, though their opinions are so very different, their facts, so far as they relate to the price of corn at least, should coincide so very exactly. It is not, however, so much from the low price of corn as from that of some other parts of the rude produce of land that the most judicious writers have inferred the great value of silver in those very ancient times. Corn, it has been said, being a sort of manufacture, was in those rude ages much dearer in proportion than the greater part of other commodities. It is meant, I suppose, than the greater part of unmanufactured commodities, such as cattle, poultry, game of all kinds, etc. That in those times of poverty and barbarism these were proportionably much cheaper than corn is undoubtedly true. But this cheapness was not the effect of the high value of silver, but of the low value of those commodities. It was not because silver would in such times purchase or represent a greater quantity of labor, but because such commodities would purchase or represent a much smaller quantity than in times of more opulence and improvement. Silver must certainly be cheaper in Spanish America than in Europe, in the country where it is produced than in the country to which it is brought, at the expense of a long carriage both by land and by sea, of a freight and an insurance. 1 in 20 pence halfpenny sterling, however, we are told by Ulloa, was, not many years ago at Buenos Aires, the price of an oxen chosen from a herd of 300 or 400. 16 shillings sterling, we were told by Mr. Byron, was the price of a good horse in the capital of Chile. In a country naturally fertile, but of which the far greater part is altogether uncultivated, cattle, poultry, game of all kinds, etc., as they can be acquired with a very small quantity of labor, so they will purchase or command but a very small quantity. The low money price for which they may be sold is no proof that the real value of silver is there very high, but that the real value of those commodities is very low. Labor, it must always be remembered, and not any particular commodity or set of commodities, is the real measure of the value both of silver and of all other commodities. But in countries almost waste, or but thinly inhabited, cattle, poultry, game of all kinds, etc., as they are the spontaneous production of nature, so she frequently produces them in much greater quantities than the consumption of the inhabitants requires. In such a state of things, the supply commonly exceeds the demand. In different states of society, in different stages of improvement, therefore, such commodities will represent or be equivalent to very different quantities of labor. In every state of society, in every age of improvement, corn is the production of human industry. But the average produce of every sort of industry is always suited, more or less exactly, to the average consumption, the average supply to the average demand. In every different stage of improvement, besides, the raising of equal quantities of corn in the same soil and climate will, at an average, require nearly equal quantities of labor, or what comes to the same thing, the price of nearly equal quantities, the continual increase of the price of productive powers of labor in an improving state of cultivation being more or less counterbalanced by the continually increasing price of cattle, the principal instruments of agriculture. Upon all these accounts, therefore, we may rest assured that equal quantities of corn will, in every state of society, in every stage of improvement, more nearly represent or be equivalent to equal quantities of labor than equal quantities of any other part of the rude produce of land. Corn, accordingly, it has already been observed, is in all the different stages of wealth and improvement a more accurate measure of value than any other commodity or set of commodities. In all those different stages, therefore, we can judge better of the real value of silver by comparing it with corn than by comparing it with any other commodity or set of commodities. Corn, besides, or whatever else is the common and favorite vegetable food of the people, constitutes in every civilized country the principal part of the subsistence of the laborer. In consequence of the extension of agriculture, the land of every country produces a much greater quantity of vegetable than of animal food, and the laborer everywhere lives chiefly upon the wholesome food that is cheapest and most abundant. Butcher's meat, except in the most thriving countries, or where labor is most highly rewarded, makes but an insignificant part of his subsistence. Poultry makes a still smaller part of it, and game no part of it. In France, and even in Scotland, where labor is somewhat better rewarded than in France, the laboring poor seldom eat butcher's meat except upon holidays and other extraordinary occasions. The money price of labor, therefore, depends much more upon the average money price of corn, the subsistence of the laborer, than upon that of butcher's meat or of any other part of the rude produce of land. The real value of gold and silver, therefore, the real quantity of labor which they can purchase or command, depends much more upon the quantity of corn which they can purchase or command than upon that of butcher's meat or any other part of the rude produce of land. Such slight observations, however, upon the prices either of corn or of other commodities would not probably have misled so many intelligent authors had they not been influenced at the same time by the popular notion that as the quantity of silver naturally increases in every country with the increase of wealth, so its value diminishes as its quantity increases. This notion, however, seems to be altogether groundless. The quantity of the precious metals may increase in any country from two different causes. Either, first, from the increased abundance of the mines which supply it, or, secondly, from the increased wealth of the people, from the increased produce of their annual labor. The first of these causes is no doubt necessarily connected with the diminution of the value of the precious metals, but the second is not. When more abundant mines are discovered, a greater quantity of the precious metal is brought to market, and the quantity of the necessaries and conveniencies of life for which they must be exchanged being the same as before, equal quantities of the metals must be exchanged for smaller quantities of commodities. So far, therefore, as the increase of the quantity of the precious metals in any country arises from the increased abundance of the mines, it is necessarily connected with some diminution of their value. When, on the contrary, the wealth of any country increases when the annual produce of its labor becomes gradually greater and greater, a greater quantity of coin becomes necessary in order to circulate a greater quantity of commodities, and the people, as they can afford it, as they have more commodities to give for it, will naturally purchase a greater and a greater quantity of plate. The quantity of their coin will increase from necessity, the quantity of their plate from vanity and ostentation, or from the same reason that the quantity of fine statues, pictures, and of every other luxury and curiosity is likely to increase among them. But as statuaries and painters are not likely to be worse rewarded in times of wealth and prosperity than in times of poverty and depression, so gold and silver are not likely to be worse paid for. The price of gold and silver, when the accidental discovery of more abundant mines does not keep it down, as it naturally rises with the wealth of every country, so, whatever be the state of the mines, it is at all times naturally higher in a rich than in a poor country. Gold and silver, like all other commodities, naturally seek the market where the best price is given for them, and the best price is commonly given for everything in the country which can best afford it. Labor, it must be remembered, is the ultimate price which is paid for everything, and in countries where labor is equally well rewarded, the money price of labor will be in proportion to that of the subsistence of the laborer. But gold and silver will naturally exchange for a greater quantity of subsistence than in a rich than in a poor country, in a country which abounds with subsistence than in one which is but indifferently supplied with it. If the two countries are at a great distance, the difference may be very great, because though the metals naturally fly from the worse to the better market, yet it may be difficult to transport them in such quantities as to bring their price nearly to a level in both. If the countries are near, the difference will be smaller, and may sometimes be scarce perceptible, because in this case the transportation will be easy. China is a much richer country than any part of Europe, and the difference between the price of subsistence in China and in Europe is very great. Rice in China is much cheaper than wheat is anywhere in Europe. England is a much richer country than Scotland, but the difference between the money price of corn in those two countries is much smaller, and is but just perceptible. In proportion to the quantity or measure, Scotch corn generally appears to be a good deal cheaper than English, but in proportion to its quality, it is certainly somewhat dearer. Scotland receives almost every year very large supplies from England, and every commodity must commonly be somewhat dearer in the country to which it is brought than in that from which it comes. English corn, therefore, must be dearer in Scotland than in England, and yet in proportion to its quality, or to the quantity and goodness of the flour or meal which can be made from it, it cannot commonly be sold higher there than the Scotch corn which comes to market in competition with it. The difference between the money price of labor in China and in Europe is still greater than that between the money price of subsistence, because the real recompense of labor is higher in Europe than in China, the greater part of Europe being in an improving state, while China seems to be standing still. The money price of labor is lower in Scotland than in England because the real recompense of labor is much lower. Scotland, though advancing to greater wealth, is advancing much more slowly than England. The frequency of emigration from Scotland and the rarity of it from England sufficiently prove that the demand for labor is still very different in the two countries. The proportion between the real recompense of labor in different countries, it must be remembered, is naturally regulated, not by their actual wealth or poverty, but by their advancing, stationary, or declining condition. Gold and silver, as they are naturally of the greatest value among the richest, so they are naturally of the least value among the poorest nations. Among savages, the poorest of all nations, they are of scarce any value. In great towns, corn is always dearer than in remote parts of the country. This, however, is the effect not of the real cheapness of silver, but of the real dearness of corn. It does not cost less labor to bring silver to the great town than to the remote parts of the country, but it costs a great deal more to bring corn. In some very rich and commercial countries, such as Holland and the territory of Genoa, corn is dear for the same reason that it is dear in great towns. They do not produce enough to maintain their inhabitants. They are rich in the industry and skill of their artificers and manufacturers, in every sort of machinery which can facilitate and abridge labor, in shipping and in all other instruments and means of carriage and commerce. But they are poor in corn, which, as it must be brought in to them from distant countries, must, by in addition to its price, pay for the carriage from those countries. It does not cost less labor to bring silver to Amsterdam than to Danzig, but it costs a great deal more to bring corn. The real cost of silver must be nearly the same in both places, but that of corn must be very different. Diminish the real opulence either of Holland or of the territory of Genoa, while the number of their inhabitants remains the same, diminish their power of supplying themselves from distant countries, and the price of corn, instead of sinking with the diminution in the quantity of their silver, which must necessarily accompany this declension, either as its cause or as its effect, will rise to the price of a famine. When we are in want of necessaries, we must part with all superfluities, of which the value, as it rises in times of opulence and prosperity, so it sinks in times of poverty and distress. As it is otherwise with necessaries. Their real price, the quantity of labor which they can purchase or command, rises in times of poverty and distress, and sinks in times of opulence and prosperity, which are always times of great abundance, for they could not otherwise be times of opulence and prosperity. Corn is as necessary, silver is only a superfluity. Whatever, therefore, may have been the increase in the quantity of the precious metals, which, during the period between the middle of the 14th and that of the 16th century, arose from the increase of wealth and improvement, it could have no tendency to diminish their value either in Great Britain or in any other part of Europe. If those who have collected the prices of things in ancient times, therefore, had, during this period, no reason to infer the diminution of the value of silver, from any observation which they had made upon the prices of either of corn or of other commodities, they had still less reason to infer it from any supposed increase of wealth and improvement. Second period. But how various soever may have been the opinions of the learned concerning the progress of the value of silver during this first period, they are unanimous concerning it during the second. From about 1570 to about 1640, during a period of about 70 years, the variation in the proportion between the value of silver and that of corn held a quite opposite course. Silver sunk in its real value, or would exchange for a smaller quantity of labor than before, and corn rose in its nominal price, and instead of being commonly sold for about 2 ounces of silver the quarter, or about 10 shillings of our present money, came to be sold for 6 and 8 ounces of silver per the quarter, or about 30 and 40 shillings of our present money. The discovery of abundant mines of America seems to have been the sole cause of this diminution in the value of silver in proportion to that of corn. It is accounted for accordingly in the same manner by everybody, and there never has been any dispute either about the fact or about the cause of it. The greater part of Europe was, during this period, advancing in industry and improvement, and the demand for silver must consequently have been increasing. But the increase of the supply had, it seems, so far exceeded that of the demand, that the value of that metal sunk considerably. The discovery of the mines of America, it is to be observed, does not seem to have had any very sensible effect upon the prices of things in England till after 1570, though even the mines of Potosi had been discovered more than 20 years before. From 1595 to 1620, both inclusive, the average price of the quarter of 9 bushels of the best wheat at Windsor Market appears from the accounts of Eton College to have been £2, 1 sterling, 6 pennies, 9 and 9/13. From which sum, neglecting the fraction and deducting a ninth, or 4 shillings, 7 pennies, and 1/3, the price of the quarter of 8 bushels comes out to have been £1, 16 shillings, 10 2/3 pence. And from this sum, neglecting likewise the fraction and deducting a ninth, or 4 shillings, 1 1/9 pence, for the difference between the price of the best wheat and that of the middle wheat, the price of the middle wheat comes out to have been about £1, 12 shillings, 8 8/9 pence, or about 6 ounces and 1/3 of an ounce of silver. From 1621 to 1636, both inclusive, the average price of the same measure of the best wheat at the same market appears, from the same accounts, to have been £2, 10 shillings, from which make the like deductions as in the foregoing case. The average price of the quarter of 8 bushels of middle wheat comes out to have been £1, 19 shillings, 6 pence, or about 7 ounces and 2/3 of an ounce of silver. Okay, well, that concludes what we're going to be reading for tonight. Tomorrow night we'll finish up with his account of what he considers the third period. Hopefully we'll be able to get through the whole thing tomorrow night. It's kind of long. So we'll see how that goes. So until then, it's been Mike, signing off.